The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual chaos, horns blaring and people rushing past one another, but inside Department 42 of the courthouse, time felt still. The air was cold, yet heavy. No one knew quite why, but everyone, attorneys, bailiffs, and even the judge, felt an unspoken weight hanging over the room. At exactly 8:55 a.m., the door creaked open and two bailiffs entered, guiding in a tall, unshaven man in handcuffs. His clothes were old but clean. His face, partially hidden under a worn navy cap, bore the weight of many years, years no one in the courtroom had lived but could somehow feel just by looking at him. Some people glanced at him with curiosity, others with pity. A few didn't even look up. He didn't look at anyone. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, as if the linoleum tiles carried secrets only he could see. The judge hadn't entered yet. The prosecutor, a young woman named Claire Nolan, flipped through her file quickly, glancing now and then at the defendant. The name on the file read, James R. McAllister, charged with trespassing, resisting arrest, and vandalizing government property. Simple, small charges. Just another homeless man who broke into a government building for shelter. But something about the name unsettled her. She couldn't place it, but it stirred something in the back of her mind. The court clerk called the session to order. Case 214B, State of California versus James Ronald McAllister. The courtroom door opened once more, and Judge Eliza Hartley stepped in. She was known for being sharp, no-nonsense, and impossible to rattle. Today, however, as she approached the bench, her gaze briefly caught the defendant's face, and her steps faltered. Just for a second. She looked again. The silence returned, deeper now, more profound. As if the walls waited for something to be said. The judge sat, adjusted her robe, and looked down at the docket. She froze. Then she said something no one expected. "Can the defendant please remove his hat?" There was no anger in her voice, just a tremble. A whisper trying not to break. The bailiff nodded, gently tapped James on the shoulder. James hesitated but removed his hat, revealing a head of graying, closely cropped hair. His expression didn't change. His eyes stayed down. Judge Hartley's hand slowly moved to her mouth. "Mr. McAllister," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. What is your middle name?" "Ronald," the man said, still not looking up. "James Ronald McAllister." For a moment she couldn't speak. She leaned back slightly, her fingers trembling on the gavel, which she didn't raise. "I need everyone to stand," she said suddenly, her voice now strong, commanding. Everyone in the courtroom blinked, confused. "Stand up, right now," she said. No one argued. Slowly, every person, attorneys, spectators, jury members, court officers, stood. James finally looked up. His eyes were a storm. Weathered, broken, unreadable. The judge rose to her feet. "I don't know how many of you understand who is standing before us," she said slowly, glancing around the room. "But this man is not just a homeless veteran. He is a decorated hero." James flinched. "I remember now," she continued. "Lieutenant Commander James Ronald McAllister, Navy SEAL, 3 Bronze Stars, 1 Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, 30 years of service. Vanished from public record after his final tour." Claire, the prosecutor, stood frozen, her hands shaking at her sides. Her mind raced back through old articles her father used to read aloud. She remembered that name. He had been a legend. Then, suddenly, gone. No articles, no books, nothing. James was motionless. The courtroom was silent. "I served too," the judge said, her voice cracking. "I was a JAG officer. I processed his commendations. I signed his name. I knew it. I knew it the moment I saw him, but I didn't believe it could be him. He was listed as MIA. James slowly raised his eyes to hers. "I was never missing, Judge. I just stopped coming back." There was a long silence. The judge sat again, her hands still shaking. The defense attorney, a man named Ruiz, leaned over and whispered something to James. James nodded. Ruiz stood. Your Honor, may we request a recess? But the judge raised a hand. No, not yet. She looked at James again. What happened, Commander? The prosecutor objected instinctively. Your Honor, this isn't. I'll allow it, the judge snapped. Everyone waited. James looked around the courtroom, slowly, carefully. Then he spoke. You want to know what happened? I came home after 30 years of war. But I didn't come back a hero. I came back a ghost. My wife had remarried. My son didn't recognize me. My name was printed in memorial plaques on 2 bases. I wasn't listed as active. I wasn't listed as retired. I was just gone. He paused. And it didn't matter, because no one came looking. The room was so quiet you could hear the distant tick of the clock above the judge's bench. I lived in my car for 6 years. Then it got towed. Then I lived on sidewalks, shelters, under bridges. People spit on me. Some gave me coffee. One guy offered me $10 to pretend to be his dying uncle so he could post it online. A few people shifted in their seats uncomfortably. And the building I was caught in, he added, used to be a vet center. It's where I went for PTSD therapy. They shut it down 3 years ago. Now it's empty. But I still go. I sit there and talk. To the air, to ghosts, to myself. Claire's eyes welled up. She quickly wiped them and looked away. James's voice was steady now. I wasn't trying to break the law. I was trying to find a place that remembered me. The judge leaned forward. You resisted arrest? James nodded. When they grabbed me, I panicked. They were shouting, grabbing. I didn't know where I was. I thought I was back in Kandahar. I reacted. The judge didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, dismissed. The prosecutor blinked. Your Honor? I said dismissed. All charges. There was a stunned silence. The clerk hesitated. The stenographer looked up. The bailiffs looked at one another. Claire didn't object. The judge stood again. And if anyone in this courtroom disagrees, they can take it up with the Department of Defense. I won't prosecute a ghost the world buried and then forgot. James just stood there, still handcuffed, still silent. The judge turned to the bailiff. Take those off him. The bailiff moved, fumbling slightly as he unlocked the cuffs. Judge Hartley descended from the bench. She walked straight up to James and stood face to face with him. Then she saluted. He didn't move. Then, slowly, like his bones had forgotten how, James raised his arm and returned it. I failed you, she whispered. No, he said. The whole system did. Someone in the courtroom began clapping. No one saw who started it, but soon others joined. Quietly at first. Then louder. Not everyone understood what they were clapping for. But it didn't matter. Because in that moment they saw a man, not a vagrant, not a criminal, not a statistic, but a man who had served, who had suffered, who had survived. The courtroom didn't just rise, it remembered. James turned to leave. Wait, the judge called. Where will you go now? James shrugged. Back to where I was, I guess. No, the judge said, not this time. She pulled a card from her pocket and handed it to him. There's a place, quiet, has a roof, veterans only. I'll make sure they have a bed ready. James looked at it, then at her. And then he finally smiled. Just a little. As he walked out of the courtroom, the murmurs didn't die down for a long time. People kept asking, was that the McAllister? No one really knew what had just happened, but everyone felt it. Outside, the sky was gray, but it didn't rain. James stood on the steps of the courthouse, staring out over the city. He didn't know where he would be tomorrow, or if the place the judge had offered would really change anything. But for the first time in a long time, someone had remembered his name. And that was enough, for now. Then a voice behind him said, Commander? He turned. It was Claire, the prosecutor. She looked nervous. I looked you up. I read your file. What you did in Fallujah and in Helmand Province. I don't know how you're still walking." He shrugged. "Some of us come back in body, not always in mind." She hesitated, then said, "Do you mind if I walk with you?" He looked at her, really looked. And for the first time in what felt like decades, he said, "Sure." And together they walked down the courthouse steps into a city that had forgotten him. But not anymore. Not completely. Not today. The city was loud again, cars honking, voices rising and falling in rushed conversation, wheels clattering across uneven sidewalks. But to James, it all felt strangely distant. Claire walked beside him, matching his slow, deliberate pace. She didn't speak, and neither did he. He noticed her occasionally stealing glances at him, as if trying to solve a puzzle too complicated for her young legal mind. He let her look. He was done hiding, for today at least. They reached the bottom of the courthouse steps, and James paused. "You sure you want to be seen walking with me?" he asked, half smiling. "People might think you've got sympathy for the enemy." Claire met his eyes. "You're not the enemy, you never were." He nodded slightly, accepting the gesture, though it didn't quite reach the scarred places inside him. There were memories inside him too heavy for that. Still, her words meant more than he expected. She offered to call a cab, but he refused. "I walk, helps me think." She nodded again and didn't argue. They moved through the city together, past gray buildings and faces locked behind screens, until they reached a quieter street lined with trees and old brick apartments. Eventually, they stopped in front of a gated building, modest but clean, with an American flag waving above the door and a brass sign that read Haven House, a place for those who served. A man in a navy windbreaker stood at the door, clipboard in hand. He had silver hair and the kind of posture that only decades in the military could build. He looked up as they approached, narrowing his eyes slightly before recognition washed over him. "McAllister?" the man said, his voice filled with disbelief. James nodded. The man stepped forward, extended his hand. "Colonel Mark Bremer, retired. I run this place. Didn't think I'd ever see you again." James shook his hand, firm but cautious. "I wasn't planning to be seen." Bremer clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, thank God you are. You've got a room here. Judge Hartley called ahead. We made space." James looked up at the building. He hadn't been inside a real home in over a decade. Even his own house, the one that used to be his, before his wife changed the locks and his name vanished from the deed, hadn't felt this secure. Claire lingered at the sidewalk. "I should go," she said, unsure. James turned to her. "Thank you for listening." She smiled. "Thank you for surviving." And then she was gone. Bremer led James inside. The lobby was quiet, lined with honor photos, medals behind glass, and folded flags encased in wooden triangles. James's eyes flicked over the names. Some he recognized, others brought back things he wished he could forget. The place smelled like coffee and clean sheets. Not bleach, not concrete, not wet cardboard. He was shown to a modest room on the second floor. Bed, desk, dresser, a small window looking out over the courtyard. Clean linens, a welcome packet, and a set of folded clothes rested on the bed. James didn't sit. He stood in the doorway for a long time, one hand still on the frame, as if stepping across the threshold would tear open something he'd been holding shut for years. "Take your time," Bremer said, sensing the pause. James finally stepped in. He sat on the edge of the bed. Soft, too soft. It made his back ache. But he didn't move. He just sat there, staring at his hands. Later that evening, after a hot shower and a change of clothes, he found himself in the common room downstairs. A few other veterans sat around, sipping coffee, watching TV, playing chess. A tall man with burn scars across his left cheek nodded at him from the couch. "You the SEAL?" he asked without looking away from the screen. James hesitated. "Used to be." The man chuckled. "Aren't we all something we used to be?" They talked. Slowly at first, carefully, like men who knew how words could be weapons, but also lifelines. James learned names: Tom, who lost his leg in Ramadi; Curtis, who'd been a medic in Iraq and still carried guilt he refused to explain. Darren, who never spoke, just played chess with invisible opponents. And then there was Eddie. Quiet guy. Air Force. Eyes like glass. They asked about James. Not directly, not too much. Veterans understood silence better than anyone. But something strange started happening the longer James stayed. People began to visit. The next morning, a man from the local VA came by. Then a therapist. Then someone from a non-profit organization who offered to replace James's lost medals. Bremer coordinated it all quietly, respectfully. James didn't say yes to everything. He didn't trust the flurry of attention. It felt like people were circling around a story, not a man. They wanted to fix him like a broken monument. They wanted to say, "We saved a hero." But they didn't know that the worst wounds weren't physical. That the hardest part wasn't sleeping under a bridge. It was waking up from nightmares and realizing no one missed you. Still, he played along. He met the therapist once, sat for half a session before walking out. The medals? He accepted them but didn't display them. He kept them in the drawer beside his bed, wrapped in an old sock. One night, around 2 a.m., James sat alone in the courtyard. The stars were barely visible through the city haze, but he stared anyway. His mind wandered. Fallujah, Helmand, Bagram, the gunfire, the heat, the deafening silence afterward. His unit. The day he didn't make it back to base. The days after that. The years. Disappearing. Then a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You should wear the medals, you know." It was Eddie, the quiet one. He'd crept up without a sound, just like James used to. James didn't answer. Eddie sat on the bench next to him. "I Googled you," he said. "Everyone did. You're a ghost story we told new recruits." James winced. "I used to think ghosts were just memories," Eddie continued. "But maybe they're just people we forgot to keep holding on to." They sat in silence after that. A long one. It didn't need to be filled. The next week, something unexpected happened. A journalist showed up. Young guy. Clean haircut. Bright eyes? Too eager? "I want to write about you," he told James. "Not just you, your story. What happened? Why someone like you can go missing for 15 years and no one blinks. People need to know." James refused. Politely at first, then firmly. He didn't want his pain turned into a headline. But the journalist didn't back off. He went to Claire, then to Judge Hartley, and then to someone at the Pentagon. And that's when things started changing. The Department of Defense launched an internal review. Old records resurfaced. Someone discovered that James's re-entry paperwork had been misfiled after his last mission. His discharge status had never been properly processed. His benefits had lapsed. His identity had fallen into a bureaucratic black hole. There was outrage. Statements were made. Reporters came. The mayor mentioned him in a speech. Suddenly, James became a symbol, not a man, a symbol of what happens when systems fail and heroes vanish between the cracks. People came by the shelter, to take pictures, to shake hands, some to cry. James hated it. He wanted to disappear again. Until one day Claire showed up. She brought someone with her. A young man, maybe 19, tall, nervous, brown hair, same eyes. James froze. "This is Tyler," Claire said gently. "Your son." James stared. Tyler looked down. "Mom told me you died," he said softly. James's throat clenched. "I thought maybe it was easier for her that way. I don't know." James couldn't speak. His heart thundered. His palms were slick with sweat. "I found out last week," Tyler continued. "I read about the trial. About you. I didn't know what to do." James's eyes stung. "I didn't know how to come back." Tyler took a step forward. "Maybe we could start small, like coffee?" James blinked, then nodded. It wasn't a reunion, not yet, but it was something, a crack in the armor. A chance. Later that night, after Tyler had left and the building was quiet again, James sat in his room, staring at the medals he'd pulled from the drawer. He lined them up on the desk, one by one. He touched each one gently, as if reminding himself they were real. The next morning he wore them. He walked downstairs slowly, fully dressed in the suit someone had donated from the local VFW post. Medals pinned neatly, head high, eyes forward. Bremer looked up from his desk. "Where you headed?" James smiled faintly. "Got a job interview. Security detail. They want someone who doesn't miss things." Bremer raised a brow. "They'll be lucky to have you." James nodded and opened the front door. The city waited beyond, louder than ever. But this time, he walked into it with his name back. And behind him, for the first time in years, the door didn't close all the way. Someone would follow. Someone would care. And his story was only beginning. The streets buzzed with the familiar chaos of the city, but James moved through it differently now. He wasn't invisible anymore. His shoes struck the pavement with quiet authority, his suit clean, his medals pinned like a declaration that he had not only survived but returned. The world hadn't changed much, still filled with people in a hurry, eyes glued to phones, hearts wrapped in urgency, but James had changed. Each step felt heavier, yet more grounded, like a soldier who had rediscovered the rhythm of civilian life. He passed a construction site where jackhammers pounded the earth, and for a moment his breath caught, the sound too close to gunfire, but he closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and kept walking. The ghosts were still there, but they didn't have him by the throat anymore. He arrived 15 minutes early. The building was a modern high-rise with tinted glass windows and a polished lobby. A receptionist with perfect posture and a tight bun glanced at his chest before looking at his face. "Mr. McAllister?" she asked. "They're expecting you upstairs. Floor 17. He thanked her, rode the elevator alone, and watched the numbers light up like the slow beat of a countdown. He didn't know if he was ready. But readiness was never a luxury in the field. You acted. You adapted. You survived. The office belonged to a private security firm. Elite, high-paying, discreet. The kind that protected CEOs, diplomats, and the sort of people whose lives were tangled in both power and danger. The interview was brief but thorough. A former Marine named Tate ran it, a broad-shouldered man with deep lines around his eyes and the slight limp of someone who'd seen too much and walked too far. "We looked into you," Tate said, folding his hands. "Back then, your name was all over classified ops. And then, nothing. You ghosted hard." James gave a small nod. "Wasn't by choice." Tate studied him. "People like us, when we disappear, we usually stay that way. So why come back now?" James looked him square in the eye. "Because I remembered who I was. And someone reminded me that I still have a name." Tate didn't blink. Then he extended his hand. "You're hired. Probation period, but I have a feeling we won't need it." James shook his hand firmly. As he left the office, there was no rush of celebration inside him, no cheering sense of triumph. Just a quiet steadiness. He had a purpose again, something to hold on to. The first assignment came a week later. A foreign journalist with controversial political ties had arrived in the city and received threats credible enough to justify a full detail. James was assigned to lead the night shift. Something about the darkness didn't scare him the way it did others. He welcomed it. Under the hum of surveillance cameras and streetlights, he felt alive. Alert. Sharpened. But something gnawed at him during those nights. Not fear. Not danger. Something quieter. Personal. Tyler, they'd met twice more since that first day at Haven House. Coffee shops, both times. Short meetings. Awkward. Like two strangers fumbling for a language neither of them had ever spoken. Tyler was cautious, protective of the anger he didn't want to admit he carried. James never tried to explain why he hadn't come back sooner. He figured the reasons didn't matter, not to a child who grew up thinking his father had abandoned him. But he listened. He asked questions. And when Tyler spoke, James didn't interrupt. That, at least, he could give his son. Space to be heard. One night, while parked outside the journalist's temporary residence, James received a message from Claire. She never used too many words. That night was no different. Need to talk. Urgent. Your name's come up again. His chest tightened. The next morning, they met at a quiet diner far from the city center. Claire looked tired, not in the physical sense, but the way someone looks when they've uncovered something they wish they hadn't. "There's a file," she said, "one I wasn't supposed to see. From a sealed archive connected to one of your last missions. Operation Grey Falcon." James's blood chilled. "You were marked Kia, killed in action, based on a single field report, but someone overrode the protocol to declare you MIA instead. That's rare, only happens when there's a possibility of recovery." James leaned forward. "What are you saying?" Claire slid a photo across the table. It was grainy, black and white, time-stamped from 13 years ago. A military encampment in the desert, and at the center of it was James. Alive. Claire continued. "That image came from a drone that went missing during a recon mission. It wasn't recovered until years later. Someone buried it, and I mean really buried it, under multiple layers of clearance, beyond even my level." "Who?" She hesitated. "There's a name. General Marcus Kellerman. He signed off on the report. He also authorized a disavowal order shortly after, which means, officially, you became someone who didn't exist." James stared at the photo. Rage began to bubble, deep and dark. Claire added, "I dug deeper. Kellerman had ties to a weapons contract that failed in your final mission zone. Billions lost. But if your unit had reported back, the truth would have come out. Instead, you all vanished. Most were listed dead. But you were the wild card. Maybe he thought you wouldn't make it out. Maybe he hoped you wouldn't." James clenched his fists. "He left us to die." Claire nodded slowly. "And when you didn't, he made sure no one could ever find you." James's voice dropped to a whisper. "I lost everything." There was silence between them for a long time. The diner clattered with forks and quiet music. Outside, the sun was rising, but inside James, a storm had begun to gather. Claire looked at him cautiously. "What do you want to do?" James didn't answer immediately. His mind was already unraveling possibilities, lines of strategy. Revenge wasn't his style, but justice was. And for the first time in years, he felt like he had the tools and the allies to go after the truth. He stood. "I need time, but I'll be in touch." That evening, back at Haven House, he found Bremer waiting for him. The old colonel looked uneasy, something rare for a man so composed. "There's someone downstairs asking for you," Bremer said. "Says he served under your command." James's brow furrowed. "Name?" "Says his name is Joel Parks. Ring a bell?" James blinked. Joel Parks had been a young medic during Operation Grey Falcon. Fresh out of training, green but sharp. James hadn't seen him since the mission fell apart. He thought Parks had died. He descended the stairs and found him in the lobby. Older now, beard flecked with gray, but unmistakably the same man. When their eyes met, neither spoke for a moment. "Captain," Parks said. "Sergeant," James replied. Then came the hug, unexpected, brief but real. Parks pulled back and looked him over. "I thought you were gone." "I was. You?" Parks nodded. "They pulled me out 2 days after the ambush. I was in bad shape. Got reassigned. I tried to find you after, but your name was off every list." James exhaled sharply. That wasn't an accident. They sat in the common room, and Parks told his story. How he'd recovered, how he'd been silenced, how any mention of Grey Falcon resulted in blank stares or veiled threats. But he had evidence, old records, copies of mission transcripts, and, most damning of all, a recording, one that featured General Kellerman's voice giving the order to abandon the team. James listened, jaw clenched. It wasn't just betrayal. It was murder by paperwork. Parks reached into his coat and handed him a USB drive. "I kept this. Figured I'd never need it. But if you're ready to do something about it, you've got proof now." James looked at the drive like it weighed 100 pounds. Later that night, he sat alone in his room. The medals were back in the drawer, but this time he didn't feel hollow. He felt ignited. He looked at the photo Claire had given him, then at the USB drive, and then, finally, he looked at his reflection in the mirror. He wasn't just going to reclaim his name. He was going to bring down the man who tried to erase it. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. So he picked up the phone. He dialed Claire first, then Bremer, then Parks. And then, after hesitating, fingers hovering over the screen, he texted Tyler. "I may be gone for a while, but I'm doing something important. I'll explain soon. Please believe that." Moments later, Tyler responded, "I believe you. Come back safe." James stared at those words for a long time. Then he stood. The past wasn't finished with him. But this time he wasn't running from it. He was hunting it. And the war wasn't over. Not yet. James packed lightly. He wasn't leaving forever, but he wasn't sure how long he'd be gone either. Just enough to find the truth, expose the betrayal, and make sure no one ever had to live in the shadows he'd been buried under. His duffel was slung over one shoulder as he walked out of Haven House before dawn, the streets still sleeping, the city's breath soft in the cold morning air. This time, there was no fear, no anxiety. Only quiet determination. James had been through hell before. This time, he was heading straight back into it, but with eyes open, scars embraced, and weapons sharpened, both literal and metaphorical. Claire met him 2 hours outside the city, in a safe house built into the side of a hill. From the outside, it looked abandoned, ivy-covered stone, broken windows, rotting wood. But inside, it was wired like a war room. Maps, surveillance feeds, dossiers, even a secure satellite uplink. Claire didn't waste time. "Kellerman is in D.C., she said, pointing to a red dot on a map. "He's been promoted twice since Gray Falcon. He's now on the board of a private defense contractor. They're lobbying for a new international military tech initiative." James nodded. "Still feeding off the war machine?" "Worse, they're pitching AI-powered autonomous weaponry. Billions at stake. And if he gets this contract approved, he'll be untouchable." Park stepped out of a back room. "And we've only got a small window. Next week, he's presenting classified data to a congressional subcommittee. Once that's in motion, it's locked." James folded his arms. "So we hit him before then. Take the evidence public." Claire hesitated. "We can't just drop this on the internet. It's not just about exposing him. The way Kellerman's moved, he's not alone. If we light this fuse without precision, it'll get buried, and so will we." Parks added, "But there's a way. One of Kellerman's aides, Janet Monroe, she's disillusioned. Been feeding us small pieces for months. She has access to the internal servers. We think she can get us the files." "What's the catch?" "She's scared," Claire said. "And with good reason. Last guy who tried to leak from the inside disappeared. Found dead a month later. Official story was an overdose. It wasn't." James paced the room. It was like planning a mission all over again. Moving parts, risky allies, a ticking clock. But this wasn't just strategy. This was personal. He stopped and looked at both of them. "Set the meat, I'll handle the rest." 2 nights later, James met Janet Monroe in a dim parking garage 3 levels below an old government archive building. She was younger than he expected, early 30s, pale, twitchy, eyes scanning every shadow like she expected one to reach out and grab her. When James stepped into the light, her hand jerked toward a pepper spray canister, but she relaxed when she saw his face. "You're him," she whispered. "McAllister?" He nodded. "You have the files?" She shook her head. "Not here, too dangerous. But I can get them. Tonight, I'll transfer them to a secured drive and bring it to the drop point Claire gave me." James studied her. "Why are you helping?" She looked down. "Because I believed in what we were doing. Until I found out what we'd done to people like you. What he did. He's a monster and no one stopped him. But I can't run. He has people everywhere. If I vanish, they'll know. James placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You won't vanish. You'll be the reason he does. She nodded quickly, as if afraid to believe it. Then she disappeared into the night. The next day, everything exploded. Janet never made the drop. Claire called James before sunrise. She's gone. Her apartment was torched. No sign of her. James sat on the edge of the bed in the safe house, breathing through the fury that flooded his chest. Did she get the files out? We don't know, but her keycard accessed the server room an hour before the fire. She might have uploaded something to an external server. Parks entered the room with a laptop, face pale. You need to see this. He opened a video feed, grainy and shaky. A back alley, lit only by a flickering street lamp. Janet Monroe, limping, blood on her face. She looked into the camera. If you're seeing this, I didn't make it. But the files, they're in the cloud, encrypted under the name Falcon. Password is McAllister's date of court-martial. Then the screen went black. James was already on his feet. Get me that footage. Get the files. I'm going to D.C. Claire grabbed his arm. James, this isn't revenge. I know, he said. It's justice. The next 48 hours were a blur of movement. Claire cracked the encryption. What they found was worse than any of them had expected. Not just abandonment. Not just betrayal. But black ops funded through illegal arms deals. Ghost units sent on suicide missions to cover up losses. Entire operations deleted from the books. And at the heart of it all, Kellerman. Authorizing, executing, profiting. James walked into the Capitol building disguised as a lobbyist. Parks had pulled strings to get him a fake ID. The press conference was in the Roosevelt Room, packed with defense contractors, political aides, and representatives from 3 countries. Kellerman stood at the podium like a king, smile polished, voice smooth. And then James walked down the aisle. The moment Kellerman saw him, he froze. Just for a second. But it was enough. A tremor in the mask. James didn't stop walking. Gasps echoed through the room. Phones snapped up. Security moved. But before they could act, James reached into his coat and pulled out a small hard drive, held high. This man is a traitor, James said, voice like thunder. And I have the proof. Chaos erupted. Reporters shouted. Guards pushed forward. But someone, one brave soul, streamed the moment live. It hit the internet like a detonation. Within the hour, hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag Gray, Falcon. Hashtag McAllister, returns. Hashtag Truth, uniform. James was arrested, of course, hauled away in cuffs. But the footage spread. And with it, the files. Claire had prepared a dead man's switch. Every news agency, every watchdog organization, every member of Congress received the data packet simultaneously. Kellerman tried to deny it, claimed the files were forged, that McAllister was a mental case, unstable. But the weight of evidence crushed him. Witnesses came forward. Other soldiers, other ghosts. Men who had been afraid to speak until James did. Weeks passed. James was released on bond pending an inquiry. Kellerman was suspended, then indicted. And through it all, James kept showing up. Not just to hearings, but to memorials. To families of the lost. To mothers who never knew what happened to their sons. One morning, standing before the grave of one of his own, Private Alan Briggs, James felt a hand slip into his. Tyler. No words. Just presence. James didn't cry. But something inside him exhaled. Deep, final, healing. Later, walking through the cemetery, Tyler said quietly, "You did what no one else would." James looked at him. "I did what had to be done." They stopped near the exit. Tyler looked up at his father. "So what happens now?" James smiled faintly. "We rebuild." The path ahead wasn't clear. There would be more trials. More questions. More digging into a past soaked in pain. But James wasn't afraid. He had a voice now, a son who believed in him, and a world finally willing to listen. And somewhere, deep in the gears of justice that had once turned against him, he could feel the shift. The war might be over, but the mission was just beginning. They walked in silence back to the car. Tyler drove. James watched the world pass through the window, familiar yet changed. The sun was out, clear skies. The city seemed quieter now, or maybe he had finally found a kind of inner quiet that made the noise bearable. That evening, back at Haven House, he stepped through the front doors and felt something shift in the air. The same men who had once kept their heads down when he walked past, who had seen him as the broken one, now straightened their backs, nodded with respect, some even standing when he entered. Not out of fear, not out of ceremony, but because James had become more than a man, he had become a symbol. Proof that truth, even when buried beneath decades of betrayal and silence, could still rise. The veterans there looked at him differently now. Some approached him with stories, hands trembling, voices raw. Others simply placed a hand on his shoulder in passing. He listened to every word. James wasn't just their advocate now. He was one of their own who had gone into the storm and come back with lightning in his fists. He met with Claire that night in the war room. The maps were gone, the boards taken down. A new project was already underway. "You've started a movement," Claire said. "There's talk in Congress. Whistleblower protections for vets. An official investigation into Project Grey Falcon. Even some families of the lost are filing lawsuits." James nodded slowly, almost absently. His mind wasn't on lawsuits or congressional talk. He was thinking about the way Kellerman had looked at him during the hearing, the mask cracking, the desperation underneath. For years, James had thought silence was the only way to survive. Now, speaking had not only freed him, but sparked a fire that could not be put out. "There's something I haven't told anyone," Claire said, shifting uncomfortably. "It's about the tribunal." James turned toward her. She handed him a slim folder. "I found a recording. One of the tribunal judges left an audio diary. It never made it into the official archive. I think you need to hear it." James sat, slid the file open, and inserted the drive into the computer. A crackled voice filled the room. "I'm not proud of what we did to McAllister. He didn't fail his unit. We failed him. We buried evidence to protect a system that was already broken. I wanted to speak up. I didn't, and now I can't sleep. I see their faces. I see his face." James closed his eyes as the voice played on, the raw guilt echoing. The tribunal hadn't been justice. It had been theater. A sacrifice of one to preserve the illusion of control. But now that illusion had been shattered. The next morning, James stood outside Kellerman's estate. He wasn't trespassing. He had an invitation. Kellerman was out on bail, confined to his property, stripped of his titles, his influence evaporating like smoke. But James needed to look him in the eyes one last time, not for revenge, but to close the loop. The guards let him in without a word. Kellerman was sitting on the patio, the once proud man now a wilted statue of his former self. Still dressed in a tailored suit, but the tie was loose, the shirt wrinkled. His eyes were tired. "You came," Kellerman said, almost a whisper. James nodded. "You knew I would." There was a long pause between them. "You're here to gloat?" "No, I'm here to understand." Kellerman let out a bitter laugh. "Understand what? That we made hard choices? That we sacrificed the few to save the many? You think this world runs on morality, McAllister? It runs on power, and power is never clean. You could have told the truth. And destroyed my career, my family, my name?" James leaned forward. "You destroyed mine." Kellerman looked away, his jaw tight. "I had orders," he said, "from men far above me. You were just a casualty." James stood. "And now you are." Kellerman didn't reply. James turned and walked away, leaving him to rot in the house that power had built, and that justice had now emptied. That night, the media announced the Department of Justice had formally indicted Kellerman on 6 counts, including conspiracy, falsification of military records, and criminal negligence resulting in death. The trial would be public, broadcasted, and James would testify. The day he entered the courtroom again, it was different. This time, he wasn't the accused. He was the truth teller. Reporters flooded the hall. Veterans lined the benches. Families of fallen soldiers wept quietly as he passed. When he took the stand, the room fell silent. And then, for the first time in his life, James told the full story. No embellishment, no rage, just the facts. The firefight, the radio calls, the silence from above. The moment he realized no one was coming, and the burden of carrying every death like a stone in his soul. He spoke of the tribunal, of the forced confessions, of the threats and the darkness. And when he finished, the judge asked if he had anything else to say. He nodded once. I'm not here to destroy anyone. I'm here because no soldier should ever be discarded like a piece of broken equipment. I buried men with honor. I held their dog tags in my hands. I carried their stories when no one else would. And if I have to spend the rest of my life making sure no one forgets them, I will. The court erupted in applause, a rare breach of decorum. The judge did not stop. And in that moment, something shifted in James. Not in the crowd, not in the world, but inside. For the first time in decades, the guilt lessened, the burden eased, the ghost stepped back. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, truly free, not just in law, but in soul. The years passed. Kellerman was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. Claire became a national figure, spearheading veteran reform programs. Parks opened an investigation unit solely for whistleblower vets. And James? James founded the Falcon Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to giving a voice to those silenced by bureaucracy, trauma, and fear. He traveled the country speaking in high schools, academies, veteran centers, telling the truth, starting the conversation. And every time he stepped up to the podium, he looked for Tyler in the crowd, because his son never missed a speech. One quiet morning, James sat on the porch of a small cabin in Montana. A simple life. Mountains in the distance. Tyler had just left for college. Letters from vets covered the table. Testimonies. Thank yous. Survivors who had found strength in his story. Claire visited now and then. So did Parks. They'd laugh, remember the war room, the chaos, the danger, and always end with gratitude that they were still here. Still fighting in their own way. And sometimes James would walk out into the woods, where the wind whispered through the pines like the voices of the fallen. He would close his eyes, whisper their names, and know they were at peace. As was he. James had gone from war hero to scapegoat to symbol to something even greater. He had become a bridge between pain and healing, between silence and voice, between past and future. And though the road had nearly broken him, it had also revealed the one truth that mattered most. Even in a world built on betrayal, truth has a way of finding its way home. And sometimes, the ones they tried hardest to bury are the ones who rise. Forever.